Hi students, today the next session is on the process of sampling. So sampling process, we were mentioning previously that the process of selecting a sample from the population is that process is what we call as sampling. But there are different steps of taking a sample from a population. There should be some scientific procedure that should happen when we select a sample from a population. So there are certain steps that we need to follow before we select a sample from a population. The first and the foremost step that needed for selecting a sample from the population is there should be a population before we select a sample. If the population exists only, we can select a sample. No. So there need to have a population. That population should be well defined. That means the distribution of that population, the age, sex, the social demographic variables of that distribution should be well defined before we select a sample from that population. That means the population should be well defined. The units, the elements, the time, everything should be well defined before we select a sample from that particular population. And then the sampling frame need to be specified. What do you mean by sampling frame? The list of the units that is present in that population need to be specified or need to be well explained before we select a sample from that population. So that frame or that list is what we call as sampling frame. So the sampling frame is a list of units that is present in that particular population. Then each sampling units need to be well defined. That each unit or each subject that is present in that population need to be well defined. We need to assign a particular number. When we have different types of sampling technique, we need to have certain number of specific terms that we need to define for each subject that is present in that population. So all these sampling units therefore need to be well mentioned there. And then we need to have some sampling methods. Which sampling method we are trying to focus to select that particular sample from that particular population, that we need to understand. That means whether the population is homogeneous, whether the population is heterogeneous, whether we are doing a study on field, whether we are doing a study on as experimental study, all need to be well defined. And then the sample size, we cannot tell that, or we cannot guess a number and then we will go and select a sample from that particular population. It should not happen like that. We need to have a specific number, exact number of what is the exact number of sample that we will select from that particular population. So for that we are having a set of formulae. For different study designs, for our cross-section study design, we are having a particular formula. For case control study, we are having a particular formula. For RCT, we are having a particular formula. For all the different study designs, we are having a set of formulae which we need to follow, where we will apply a particular measures and then we will get the sample size. That sample size need to be selected from that particular population. And then the last is we need to have a sampling plan. That means how many days you need to collect the particular sample from that particular population, or what is the number of investigators you need to arrange so that you can select this particular sample from that particular population, which all days you will go, which is the available time. All this need to be mentioned specifically in your sampling plan. So by having all these steps, the last only the method where you can select the sample. So these 7 steps are there when you select a particular sample from a particular population. And that is why we are having certain terms which we need to keep in our mind when we go for sampling technique. The first is what we call as a representative sample. We mentioned in the previous session there that the sample should be a representative part of the population. The representative part means what? The characteristics which we are studying about that particular population need to be mentioned in the sample. Then only we can tell that the sample can be considered as a representative part of the population. Then only our study, the aim of our study will be met when we take a representative part of the population into the sample. And then sampling frame is, as we were mentioned, a list of every member of the population that is there using the sampling criteria to define eligibility. The list is referred to as the sampling frame. So the list that is there about each individual that is present in the population, that list is what we call as sampling frame. And sampling plan is of course the plan that outlines strategies that is used to obtain a sample for a study. Now we are having different types of sampling techniques or sampling design. Two types of sampling designs are there, broad classification. The first is what we call as probability sampling, and the second is what we call as non-probability sampling. Probability sampling, probability from the word itself, it is clear. You may have heard this word, this term when you were there in your maths class in 9th and 10th classes. Probability means it always gives a chance. What is a definition of probability? Number of favorable cases divided by total number of cases. And of course, the values of probability lies between 0 and 1. No negative number can be assumed. All these are there in your mind. Keeping that in your mind, now you come to probability sampling. What do you mean by probability sampling? We are assigning a particular probability to each and every unit of the population so that that particular individual can be selected into the sample. That is what you mean by probability sampling. That means each and every unit is having a particular probability, equal chance of being selected. That is what you mean by probability sampling. For example, you as your class itself is semester 5 students can be considered as a population, of which we know that 29 students are there. If I need to select one student from this class, what's the probability of selecting? 1 divided by 29. So in probability sampling, each one of you is having that equal probability of being selected. That means it is 1 divided by 29. 1 is the number of favorable cases and 29 is the number of total cases, total number of students that is there in your class. Non-probability sampling means what? We are not assigning a particular any probability for the individuals that is there in the population. As and when, according to my convenience, according to the convenience of the investigator, if we are selecting the sample, then that type of sampling technique is what we call as non-probability sampling. There are different types of non-probability sampling techniques are there: convenience sampling, quota sampling, purposive sampling, and all. But when we talk about types of sampling, probability sampling is always advantageous than compared to non-probability sampling. Why? Because we were mentioned in the previous session that why we are selecting a sample, we need to study about that population. But it's a very tedious process to go to each and every unit of the population. So what we will do, we will select a sample. Ultimately, once we get the result of that sample, what we will do, we will go back to the target population. We will go back to the population in which we need to do that study, and then we will tell that the result of the sample can be generalized to that of the population. So that generalization, if it should happen in a scientific manner, always it is advisable to select probability sampling rather than convenience sampling, rather than non-probability sampling. It is always advisable to select probability sampling because there is a scientific procedure in selecting a sample from the population in the case of probability sampling. So there are 4 methods in probability sampling. The first is what we call as simple random sampling. The second is stratified random sampling. Third is systematic sampling, and last one is cluster sampling. Now we will go in detail with each of these sampling technique. So simple random sample technique. So what is simple random sample? The population in this simple random sampling technique is considered to be homogeneous. That means, what do you mean by homogeneous? It is considered to be homogeneous, it is considered to be small, and should be readily available. Homogeneous means what? How you people are homogeneous? You are homogeneous in the sense that you are all medical students in our medical college. That means in that way you are homogeneous. How you are heterogeneous? You belong to the population of 2 different genders. That means in that way you are heterogeneous. So that's the meaning of homogeneity. Understood? So here, simple random sample can be applied only if the population is homogeneous, only if the population is small and it is readily available. And simple random sample technique can be applied only in experimental designs like RCTs and all, in randomized controlled trials and all, only we can apply simple random sample. Everyone in the population has an equal chance of being selected. Each and every unit in the population is having an equal chance of being selected in simple random sampling technique. So which are the two? There are 2 methods in simple random sampling technique. The first method is what we call as lottery method, and the second method is what we call as random number table method. Lottery method means what? If I want to select, say, the number which I got after sample size calculation is 6. If 6 units need to be selected from your population of 29 subjects, what will I do? I will put the lots of, say, I will assign you the numbers 1 to 29 for each of you. And then what will I do? I will write each of your numbers from 1 to 29 in different lots. And then we will put it in a pot, and I will ask any one of you to select 6 different lots from this group of lots. So each one will come and select 6 different lots from this group. So that method is what we call as lottery method. So different numbers can be selected randomly. Random method is applied there, and that is why it is so called as simple random sampling technique. So this is what we call as lottery method. Random number table method, when you come for practical posting classes, I will show you how we will select numbers from random number table. The next method is what we call as systematic sampling technique. Systematic sampling technique is where we can apply this technique only if the population is, or when the population is heterogeneous, this sampling technique can be applied, and if the population is large, it is scattered. That is why the systematic random sampling technique is applied when in field experiments, when we go for house visits and all, as we have gone for the family health study and all. Like that, when we go for house visits in field surveys where the population is heterogeneous, we can apply systematic sampling technique. Now, what's the first step we will do in systematic sampling technique? There we need to have, in systematic sampling technique, we need to have one size of the population need to be known. The sample size need to be known. So these 2 units need to be known when we select a systematic sampling technique from a population. The size of the population need to be known, and the sample size need to be known. So that is what we call as, once it is known, then we will calculate one interval called sampling interval, which is represented as k, where k is equal to population size divided by sample size. Once the sampling interval is known, so that is the first step in systematic sampling technique. What is the first step? Fix the sample size and the population size, and then calculate the sampling interval called k, where k is equal to capital N divided by small letter n, where capital N is the size of the population and small letter n is the sample size. Once k is fixed, what's the next step is that we will select the first unit from the population into the sample, into the systematic sample by applying the random method. That means the first unit is selected either by applying lottery method or random number table method. Simple random sampling technique. By applying the simple random sampling technique, we will select the first unit into the population. How? That means we will select a number between 1 and k. So if assume that our size of the population is 29, the sample size is 6. So that means 29 divided by 6 is 4.8. So that means we will round it to 5. So that means 5 is the sampling interval which we need to fix. So if 5 is the sampling interval, once the sampling interval 5 is fixed, what we will do, we will select one number between 1 and 5. So how we will select that number between 1 and 5? That number between 1 and 5 is selected by applying simple random sampling technique, either by lottery method or by random number table method. Understood? So how this k is fixed as 5 here. So select any number between this 1 and 5. Put a lot, and then between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 like that. Put separate lots for each numbers and then select a number from it. If the number selected is third one, 3 is the number selected. So that means who is selected into the sample initially? The first unit selected into the sample is third person is selected into the sample. Who will be the next person selected? 3 plus 5. 8th person will be selected into the sample. 8 plus 5. 13th person will be selected into the sample. 13 plus 5. 18th person will be selected into the sample. 23rd person will be selected into the sample. Then 28th person will be selected into the sample. Like this, all the 6 units will be selected into the sample. This technique is what we call as systematic random sampling technique. So here the first thing we need to note is that we need to fix the sample size and the population size. The next technique is what we call as stratified random sampling technique. In this, what we need to know is that the population is heterogeneous. Only if the population is heterogeneous, we can apply stratified random sampling technique. That means dividing the whole heterogeneous population is divided into homogeneous subgroups. For example, if I want to do a study on the academic performance, is there exist any difference in the academic performance of based on the gender in your population? That means gender is the basis of the heterogeneity there in this group. That means I am dividing you based on your gender. That means the heterogeneous population based on gender. Now your group is heterogeneous. So this heterogeneous group is divided into homogeneous subgroups. So all the males in one group and all the females in another group. After that, what will I do? Once the males and females are, once the two groups are fixed, now the next step is that from this each group we will select the required number of sample, either by applying simple random sampling technique or by applying systematic random sampling technique. So that is the procedure in stratified random sampling technique. And one more thing you want to note here in the stratified random sampling technique is that based on the proportion of the population, as we know, we all know that in our college the males are proportionately more than females. So, sorry, opposite. Females are proportionately more than males. So what we will do, the proportion of the, or the ratio of male to female here in Assisia is 1:3. Understood? So the same proportionate we want to select when we will select a stratified random sample. That means males will be smaller group and females will be larger in that group. So proportionately we want to draw the sample from each strata. Understood? So each homogeneous subgroup is what we call as stratum. So that is why it is so called as stratified random sampling technique. So whole heterogeneous population is divided into homogeneous subgroups. Each of homogeneous subgroups we will select the required number of sample either by applying simple random sampling technique or stratified random sampling technique. So population is divided, these homogeneous subgroups are called strata. And the samples are drawn from each stratum proportionately based on the size of the stratum. Now the next is what we call as cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is not mentioned in your park, but you need to know what is cluster sampling. In cluster sampling, unlike other sampling technique, the sampling unit is not individual. It is a cluster. The cluster as such is considered as the sampling unit. For example, if I want to do a study on immunization coverage in a particular area. So, for example, in Kerala. So now 2 stages are there in cluster sampling. First one is that this whole Kerala or whole state is divided into 2 or 3 or 4 geographical areas. Maybe south zone, north zone, east and west. Like that we can divide. After that we will select, if we were doing the immunization coverage based on certain, say, some Anganawadi. So we will select each cluster, required number of Anganawadis will be selected from each district or from each state. Like that, we will select the Anganawadis from each district. So for in the south zone, if we have selected Kollam, so we will list out all the number of Anganawadis that is present in Kollam district. And then we will select the required number of Anganawadis that is present in Kollam district. Say 50 Anganawadis we will select in Kollam district. Understood? So each Anganawadi is considered as a cluster, not an individual here. So that is the difference between the cluster sampling and all other type of sampling techniques. In the previous one, each sampling unit was a single individual, but in cluster sampling, it is not sampling individual, not a single individual, but it is a group of individuals. And then we will select all the beneficiaries or all the individuals that is there, all the children in the Anganawadis will be selected into the sample. So this is what we call as cluster sampling. So it is used when the population is large and scattered. Cluster itself can be considered as a sampling unit and a random sample of clusters can be selected. Cluster sampling involves less time and money. Now we will go in detail about the merits and demerits of each of this. Simple random sampling. It requires, what are the merits there? It requires minimum knowledge about the population. Since the population, units of the population are very well known to us, only that is required for us to select a simple random sample from that population. It is free from all classification errors. No classification is needed here. Sampling errors can be easily calculated. So sampling errors, there are different types of errors when we deal with sampling. Sampling and non-sampling errors are there. So what do you mean by sampling error? Sampling error means if so far we were mentioning that there is one population, only one sample will be selected from that population. But imagine that we are selecting multiple number of samples from the same population of fixed size. See, we were mentioning that you 29 are there, we will select a sample of size 6 from you, from your population. But if I am telling that we will select a sample of a set of samples, 3 set of samples will be selected of same size. That means, for example, we will explain it with an example. So if who's there? Naufa. I am asking Naufa to select a sample of size 6. That means 6 units you select from your population, from this 29 groups. I am asking another one, Alisha, to select a sample of size again 6 from the same population. I am asking Rahul to select a sample of size 6 from the same population. So each of you have selected a sample of size 6 subjects from the same population. Now what will we do? We are doing, after selecting the sample, I ask them to find the, once the subjects are there, I ask them to measure their height and calculate the average height for each group. So Rahul calculated his sample unit's height. He got the height as 1.61. Alisha got her sampling unit's height as average height, I am telling, average height as 1.62. Naufa got her average height as 1.60. You can see that there is difference in average height between these samples. So why this difference is happening? This difference is what we call as sampling error. That means even though they have selected the sample from the same population, when they have calculated the measure, there is difference in measures. There is difference in their averages. So this difference is what we call as sampling error. So how we can minimize the sampling error, or what are the factors that influence the sampling error? The size of the sample and the individual reading have the influence on sampling error. So that again you will study in detail when you come for the practical sessions. Then what are the demerits? So this sampling error can easily be calculated in the case of simple random sampling. Demerits, what are the demerits here? Does not make use of knowledge about the population. We don't need anything about the population, only we need to know the names of the units that is present in the population. Cannot be, so that is the demerit here in the simple random sample. Cannot be applied in field of survey. If in field survey, what is happening? In fields experiments, field surveys means the population is heterogeneous. If the population is heterogeneous, of course we cannot apply simple random sample. It is often difficult for the investigator to have up-to-date list of all the elements of the population. So if we are going to have a study today or tomorrow or in the coming month, it is very difficult for us to get the data as of now from a particular population. Again, that demerit of simple random sample. The systematic sampling technique merits are distribute the sample more evenly over the entire population. So the entire list of the population, units of the population is selected by using simple random sampling technique. We have seen that in our example itself. The third one is selected, then the 8th one is selected, 13th one is selected, so that till 29 we are selecting with a particular fixed interval, we are selecting the units of the population into the sample. So it is because of that systematic sampling technique can be applied in field studies where the population is heterogeneous. It requires less time. Demerits is that the first and the foremost demerit of this systematic sampling is that you have noticed that only the first unit selected is random in systematic sampling technique. That means we have selected the number between 1 and 5, 1 and k. Only that is considered as random. The next numbers are selected because the sampling interval was 5. Understood? So we mentioned that the number we have selected is third person. So 3 is the number selected. So after 3, since the sampling interval was 5, the 8th person was selected. Since the sampling interval was 5, the 13th person was selected. So thereafter there is no any randomness in selecting the systematic sampling technique. That's a drawback of systematic sampling technique. Sometimes result into a badly biased sample. And stratified random sampling technique, the merits are it is superior to simple random sample because it ensures representative of all the population. The whole heterogeneous population is divided into homogeneous subgroups. So we are selecting each and every unit of the population. We are considering them. It can be kept small in size without losing its accuracy based on the basis of how we are dividing, based on what we are dividing them into homogeneous strata. We can keep that strata into small size also. Characteristics of each stratum is estimated. Then what are the demerits? Requires accurate information on proportion of the population. The accurate information of the proportion of the population is not known, then the stratified random sampling technique is very difficult to calculate, or it's very difficult to take the sample from it. We can divide them into homogeneous subgroups, but if we are not knowing that the males are comparatively less in our college than compared to females, what will happen? We will select equal number of males and females from both groups, which is wrong. Understood? So that is why we are telling that once we are dividing this heterogeneous group into homogeneous subgroups as strata, from each strata based on the size of the strata, proportionately we need to select the sample from each strata. It's very costly to prepare stratified list of all members. There is always a possibility of faulty classification. Then there are three major decisions on the basis of which we need to do stratification. The first one is the basis of stratification is to be decided. So we were mentioned that if we are doing a study on the difference of academic performance based on gender. That means what is our basis of stratification? Gender. That means we are dividing into two groups, males in one group and females in another group. Like that, we need to know the basis of stratification. The number of strata. What is the number of strata? Like that, how many strata are there? So in this case, only two. But if there are, for example, if we need to do whether there exists any lockdown strategies. Is there any difference in lockdown strategies in various districts in Kerala? So in that case, what is the number of strata? All the districts, 14 districts are there. So each district is considered as one strata. Understood? So like that, 14 districts are there. So that number need to be known. That number of strata need to be known when we do the stratification. Strata sample size. What is exact number of sample size need to be selected from each strata? That also need to be known. So these are the certain sampling technique which you need to know when you select a sample from a population. And of course, this part is very important for you in exam point of view also, both in university and in practical. So please go through this. I will give you the assignment, and I am having a small request that if you continue to send me the assignment like this that you have done previously, I won't give you attendance henceforth. That is final, and again I am not going to give any communication regarding that. If I give the questions in the assignment need to be written properly and without asking anybody, in your own logical, reasonable thinking. So that is why we are putting assignment here. It's not that we are not having anything here sitting idle and then we are putting the assignment. It's not like that. It's to assess whether you have gone through this topic. That is why we are putting the assignment. Otherwise, we can simply ask you some questions and then you can give the answer in writing. It's not like that. You need to know that what we have taught. Again, these portions we will never teach you again when you come back to your college, in our college. So please go through this assignments, read the question properly, and only 8 or 9 variables you have sent in the last assignment. Can you imagine, in anatomy, in biochemistry, everywhere you are having some 30 to 40 variables there. So at least you could have written some 10 variables from each subject. I thought you will write like that. Anyway, but in sampling, I am giving you some assignment, and if you are not writing it properly, I won't communicate it again like what I have done previously. I will mark you absent, everybody. No doubt in that. Thank you.